Okay, there's this word in Greek called dogmasin or whatever. It's translated dogma. So it's often translated ordinance. Okay? In the New Testament, it's like, I think it's used 4 times. And it's often associated with, judgments, commandments, and ordinances and laws. And I would argue, just from the top here, to say those words are overlapping and interchangeable and must be understood carefully and contextually. And that's not an excuse, that's just the reality of how those terms are used. And you'd have to argue is what you can't do, which is a common mistake, is take those English words and even find them in the Greek and assume that they mean exactly distinct things every time in the exact same way. That may be true, could be true, but it's not necessarily true because that's not how language works, and that can be demonstrated. And no matter what your view is on anything, there is no system of theology that can follow that rule precisely and remain consistent, which is the proof that that is a fallacy. It's a known fallacy. I can't demonstrate it at the moment, but I look, you'd have to study it out. Don't take my word for it, but I know that that's the case. If you don't believe it, if you're able to look honestly at why that is the case and challenge yourself, you will find that is the case. Not by necessity that it can't use the words in the same way in different places, in different contexts, but that declaring that necessarily those terms always mean the exact precise same thing in every context is false, is my claim. But that doesn't negate the idea that they can be used the exact same way in different contexts. It's that saying that they must, by necessity, is not the case. That's all I'm saying. That's the claim. I can't prove it at the moment. Moving on. I've noticed this about people who are Hebrew roots who I largely agree with and identify with in more than other theology, okay? But they commit a fallacy. That word, translated dogma, they say, because this needs to be true for their view to be right, completely right, in the nuanced way it disagrees with my position, which is, in this case, more aligned with classic Christianity, which is largely lost today because of Sabbath derangement syndrome. People making new arguments because rather than conforming to the truth that someone's pointed out, they make new arguments to justify themselves, even though their own theology that they're standing on agrees with what I'm saying. But rather than be corrected, they'd rather make up new excuses that no one ever believed, even though they'd taken that theology from people who believed like I do. And then a lot of times some people will then seek to disparage, slander, malign, lie about my tradition. It is a fearful defense mechanism, which then causes people to not hear the truth and malign people who are advocating for things that are true and consistent in defense of their own scared selves because they're scared or prideful to correct. That's my assessment. And I've been looking at it for a long time. And it makes me mad because I want people who I consider to be my brothers and sisters to come into the truth and be honest, but they don't. And I don't like that because I'm on Jesus' team. And the truth sets you free. Okay, so the term translated ordinance, dogma, is not always talking about man's decrees, even though that word is used to talk about like the decrees of Caesar. They're just an authority that makes a rule. And of course, God's authority is supreme. And we can give examples of that term being used clearly in the context to speak of Caesar's decrees. But this is a similar error they make with the term moedim, saying it has to mean appointed times that are part of God's eternal law. That could be true, but that term has a broader use. It just can mean a festival, or it can mean just an appointed time generally. The Moedim didn't exist in Genesis 2. because the Passover didn't happen yet. And keeping Passover is a commemoration of an event that has an origin in time and space that came right before they received the law. There was no Passover before the Passover event occurred. Even though the term for God's appointed festivals, which at a certain point in time include the holy days, which includes the Passover, which is commanded to keep forever, but it has an origin. Just like the weekly Sabbath has an origin. And it didn't exist before, because the Bible actually says the origin of the Passover is the event. That's called the Passover because of what occurred in the event. But the Passover is part of the quote-unquote Moedim. It's a moed, an appointed time. God put the moon and stars in the sky. That would eventually be the thing that governs the Moedim, which just means seasonal thing, an appointed time based on those signs. That's the general sense. But it doesn't mean, therefore, the Passover existed before the Passover event occurred. See, every Moedim is an appointed time. But that doesn't mean there was a Passover ever since there was an appointed time in the general sense. It can be referring to a particular festival or the idea of set times in general. Both are true. But just because the word is used here in this way doesn't mean there's not a broader sense. And it doesn't mean you can transfer particular definitions in a lexicon into any context. That's a fallacy. It's a misapplication of what the text is saying. They don't give you, it could be any of these definitions. And so you can just put whichever one you want in there because it's on the list of definitions for a word. That's the fallacy. There's the context constrains, and the definitions that are in the lexicon are derived because of how the term is used in its context. That's why there's different definitions. Because they're not all every usage of the term means all or any of those. That's the negative infer or the totality transfer fallacy. It's not the case that you can transfer any of the meanings into any of the usages. That's not how that works. It's the other way around. There are multiple definitions because of how the term is used in the different contexts. And that is the case, that's how it works. But it is possible that they could get it wrong. In other words, it's like the majority could believe a particular definition, or it may encompass, say, if there's 4 different definitions for a word because of its usages in the lexicon. It could be true that the person who wrote the lexicon didn't realize there is an aspect of multiple definitions, or all of them, that might apply in a certain context. They can get it wrong. But that it's still true that you can't just use any of them willy-nilly without making a case for it. That's logical. And see, this is the fallacy that happens with dogma sin. Here's why. They say whenever that term is used, dogma is kind of a bad word in our modern vernacular, which is what derives that word from, the word dogma. Like an ordinance by the authority of God, which the church claims, and we think of it, the Catholic Church claims to sort of what they do is what God's doing. And they talk about dogmas because they go way back, and that term comes out of that Greek term. I think in the Latin, probably, something like that. And so we have this sort of, our Protestant sort of culture is kind of, dogmas are bad, right? It's like some thing the church says you have to do, or you're going to hell by their authority, which is God's authority, right? So we have this kind of connotation. That word is a bad word, but no, that's not the case. It just means an ordinance imposed by an authority figure, which may or may not be in alliance with God properly. But the word just can mean, so in a particular context, a dogma could have that sort of justifiable stain to the sort of use there, right? Like if it's something that God didn't ordain and someone's claiming God did ordain it, but it's just imposed by men against the will of God, that can be a dogma. The context would determine that, right? Context determines whether that has that sort of definition to it or connotation to it. But the general sense, it's an ordinance imposed by authority, which may or may not be good or bad, or may not be in the will of God. That's the general sort of loose, unconstrained general definition. The context will constrain it. Well, that word is not always man's decrees or Takano or an imposition of Caesar or something, even though it is used that way. And we know this isn't the case because the Hebrew roots, this word is used in Acts 15, where the apostles are telling the converts rules they have to do. And that's the same word for dogma. Now, let me ask you, is that from God? And of course, everyone believes that's from God because the apostles, and it's recorded in the text. Whatever anyone, there's different interpretations of how to apply there in Acts 15, whether that's all the Gentiles will have to do, or if it's something they have to do immediately and they'll learn more later. Doesn't matter. It's the apostles telling people who are joining the church what to do. That term is used. And is what everybody agrees on, whatever their interpretation, is that that's something that God was telling through the apostles to the converts. So that's a use of that same term, and it's talking about an ordinance of God, from God, something we're supposed to do. So the excuse that it always means imposed by man, in a bad sense, is not true. Even if you're a Hebrew roots person, you can't sustain that claim, which is potentially the claim of why you can say it's not talking about God's law because, and then they'll say because that word is always used. It depends on what you mean by that. It could be the case that every use of that term is talking about man's laws. That's possible, but it's not that that's a rule. That every time that term is used in the Bible, it means that. You could just mean that's how it's the only way it's used in the Bible, which is possible. But to claim that word is only means something that's not God's law, that's false. And that's what proves that claim wrong. Not only is it not the case that that term can be used because of its constraints of meaning, that it's man's law, that's false. But then if you're making the lesser claim that, well, it's only used for that in the New Testament, but that's also false. Because you don't even think that. Because you think that word is used when it's regards in Acts 15, speaking of what the apostles taught to the new converts. So stop using that argument, Hebrew roots. It's not true. You're saying something not true that you yourself don't even hold to. Because that term can be used. It could be talking about God's law, could be talking, and certainly does in certain circumstances, speaking of the laws of Caesar, which is not God's law. Okay? But generally, the term, in a general, loose sense, a way of defining it that kind of loosely covers all the usages, is just that it's a law imposed by an authority figure, which may or may not be from God, or good or bad, or whatever. That's determined by context. So, now that we can stop using that bad argument that isn't true to make a claim that bolsters your interpretation, even though it's not actually true, even by your own standard. Okay, now the question is, how is it used? Well, the big question is Ephesians 2. Wiping out the commandments contained in ordinances by his flesh, he took out of the way. That's talking about the same thing that Hebrews 9 is talking about, even though Hebrews 9 doesn't use the dogma word. They're ordinances, because ordinance is a proper definition, even though the Greek terms are different, because it's a law that doesn't have eternal, lasting necessity to be performed. That's why the term ordinance was used, because ordinances are something you just decree to do, which may or may not be permanent. It's usually words like commandment or decree. Well, not even really decree, but commandment. is more likely to be a lasting. This is why categories which aren't explicitly in the text exist, because they're useful and have application to the meaning of the text, even though the Bible doesn't use the term moral, ritual, ceremonial, civil, judicial sort of law. Because those distinctions are real, even though the words aren't specifically used, they actually have use and value because of things like I just said. Because it is talking about things like needing to do sacrifices, which were things you had to do from God that aren't permanent. And by the way, stop saying forever always means it can't be done away with. That's not true. The text doesn't allow that. Because there's things that are said to be eternal that aren't still occurring. Context determines meaning. Forever does mean ongoing without end, depending on the context. That's one of the definitions. Again, universalists do this. Oh, let me show you how sometimes the word, when it's translated forever, it doesn't actually mean ongoing duration without end. Therefore, it never means that. Whoa, 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 whoa. False. The premise is false. It's true that it doesn't always mean ongoing duration without end into the foreseeable future. It doesn't always mean that. That's also true. That doesn't then prove that it never means that. Context, usage, determines meaning. That's why the lexicons have multiple definitions for words, because that's how language works.